Hello revolutionaries, this is our video for week 11, day 2. Our subject today is Socialist Realism, which was the official aesthetic of the Soviet arts that was established in the 1930s. And our teaching assistant today is Dante. So this week, I've met with just about all of you to discuss your research questions and list of sources for your final papers. I think these meetings have gone really well, and it's been great to see all of you and to talk with you about your ideas for your papers. I still have not met with Liam and Owen. So Liam and Owen, if you are watching this video, or if you are someone who is friends with them and watching this video, tell them please ET phone home. Get in touch with me so that we can talk about your final papers. I want to make sure everybody's on track with that project as we head into the last couple weeks of the semester. It's okay if Liam and Owen, it's okay if you don't know what you want to do with your papers yet. Let's just touch base. Okay, so the next step in our final paper assignment, as I've told all of you by now, is the 3-page rough draft. This draft should include your introduction and your thesis statement, as well as part of the body section of your paper. What I want to do is make sure that you've been able to identify your argument and see how you are doing with working with primary sources, using them as evidence for your argument. So this is due on Friday, April 24th at 5 p.m. And once again, you should submit it on Sakai. I'll send you back written comments on those. I'm not requiring you to meet with me again. However, if you would like to meet with me again, you are very welcome to do so. Just let me know whether you want to have another in-person meeting to discuss the comments. Okay, so today we're taking our investigation of Soviet cultural revolution into the Stalin era. And believe it or not, this is actually also the last day of our unit on cultural revolution. So congratulations, we've done a whole unit in this class remotely. I don't know about you, it feels to me like this unit actually went by very quickly. There's been a lot of other things going on, a lot of distractions. So congratulations on getting through it. And since we are at the end of another unit, this is a good time to start thinking again about the timeline. Let's see, lost my place in my script. Yes. So go ahead and reach out to your timeline group. If you forgot who's in your group, you can find that on the course website. There's a tab for timeline groups. Send out an email, connect with those folks, figure out what you are going to put on the timeline for cultural revolution. I was looking at the timeline earlier today. It looked like there were not any posts yet for social revolution either. Now you have time. Timeline posts are not due until the last day of class, but you're starting to work on your final papers. I don't want you to feel like too many things are going on at once. So I think that this is a good moment to coordinate with your group, figure out what you want to do for social revolution, what you want to do for cultural revolution. Just get those things up on the timeline spreadsheet and into the timeline. I don't expect you to spend a lot of time on it, but you'll just want to get that done. So that's another piece of the puzzle that you can say, okay, done, dusted, out of the way, time to focus on the final paper. All right. Socialist realism, what was it? Well, this is the million-dollar question of Soviet cultural history. The sources we're reading for today are going to help us explore those questions, but first I'll fill in some historical context for you. Last time we talked about the various theories and experiments for creating a new Soviet culture that were going on in the 1920s. We looked at two major schools of thought, the avant-gardists and the proletarians. But the Soviet government didn't take a side in this debate during the 1920s, but with the start of the first 5-year plan and the Cultural Revolution, through which Stalin created his new elite, it finally did. From 1928 onward, the Commissariat of Enlightenment, which had a fabulous name and which was the Soviet Ministry of Culture in the early period, they didn't so much declare a position as allow the proletarians to gain the upper hand, to sort of take over cultural life and its direction as non-government actors. It's worth considering why that side, the proletarian side, was able to gain official favor in this period. Thinking back over the ideological platform of the Russian Association of Proletarian and Musicians, consider how did their approach to the arts fit with the state's other priorities during the first 5-year plan period. Okay, so once the proletarians had free rein, they quickly hounded the avant-gardists out of work. The Russian Association of Proletarian Writers demanded that all literature be immediately accessible to the masses, many of whom were just learning to read thanks to a wide-ranging Soviet literacy campaigns. So if you were going to write something after 1928, it had to be really, really simple. They declared that the literature of the industrial worker state must be about industrial labor, and they started sending writers to factories so that they could write about what they saw and nothing else. But because this literature must educate readers in Soviet values like collectivism, they also decided that it shouldn't have individual heroes or romantic subplots. Rather, labor itself should be the hero, and the characters should focus entirely on their production goals. A similar situation developed in music. The avant-garde was pushed out, and popular songs and jazz were declared to be examples of bourgeois decadence. So new music had to be short, simple, easy to sing, and preferably have lyrics about the glories of socialist labor. In visual art, the leftist art that Arbatov was promoting in our reading for last time, that was removed from view, and only the strictest realist images of workers and communist leaders were permitted. By the end of the first 5-year plan, the results of these policies became clear. Bad literature, bad music, bad art. For all its political bona fides, proletarianism was unable to generate anything inspiring in the arts. Hero-less novels about collective labor turned out to be boring and unartistic. Mass songs like Life Has Become Better were fine here and there, but as the entire musical diet, they kind of made you want to gag. And strict realism in painting was hardly more exciting than either of those things. Since the proletarians had also consigned all the arts of the bourgeois past, quote-unquote bourgeois past, to the dustbin of history, that left the Soviet art scene pretty much barren, and something had to change. Now, the second 5-year plan period, from 1933 to 37, is often seen as a time of pulling back from a revolutionary fervor in terms of society and culture. As we've learned, Stalin ended the policy of promoting workers from the bench into higher education, and his new elite settled into privileged lives. Now that the Soviet Union had been industrialized, urbanized, and modernized, and taken its place among the leading nations of the world, Stalin felt that it needed to be a leader in culture as well. And the low-quality art of the Cultural Revolution just wasn't going to cut it. So the Stalinist state pursued 2 avenues. On one hand, classics like Pushkin, the composer Peter Tchaikovsky, the painter Ilya Repin, all those guys get put back into the canon, and they get reconceptualized as progressive artists. You know, they're given a sort of a political view that they may or may not have had, that it was more in favor of the people, and that makes them, adequate, virtuous Soviet precursors. On the other hand, the Soviet art world was turned on its head again by a new official policy for new literary works and artistic works on the whole. So this policy started in 1932 when the Central Committee announced that all proletarian organizations would be disbanded and replaced by official creative unions. The Union of Soviet Writers formed almost immediately and scheduled its first all-union congress for 1934. It was at this Congress that Central Committee Secretary Andrei Zhdanov, whose brief included ideological affairs, announced that all art must now adhere to the official Soviet aesthetic of socialist realism. And you've read his speech. All new works would be vetted by government censors, and anything that didn't meet this standard would be banned. Among European censorship policies, socialist realism is unique in that it dictates not only what artists must not do, but also what they must do. So it's both proscriptive, don't do this, and prescriptive, do this. Even so, as you've no doubt noticed, Zhdanov's definition of socialist realism in this speech is kind of vague. As a result, it became part of the work of organizations like the Union of Soviet Writers to look back through previous works that had received approval and create a new canon from which more specific aesthetic principles could be derived. Valentin Kataev's 1932 novel, Time Forward, from which we're reading an excerpt today, is one such work. We'll also be discussing it through the lens of the scholar Katerina Clark's study, The Soviet Novel, which aims to explain socialist realism. So that's enough background. Let's get to some discussion questions. And we're going to start with the secondary source, Clark's chapter 1 of Clark's The Soviet Novel. So Clark begins by outlining 2 different versions of how Soviet literature developed, one created by Soviet scholars and the other created by Western scholars. How does each side tell this story of the development of Soviet literature? According to Clark, what is wrong with each version? How does ideology factor into these 2 different narratives? Given that we're dealing with a policy derived from official Soviet ideology, why is it important for us as scholars to see past this ideological framework? How will doing so help us understand socialist realism? Number 2, Clark explains that socialist realism was pieced together from two previous competing theories, proletarian realism and revolutionary romanticism. What do these terms mean? What is valuable about each of them from the perspective of the Soviet state? How do they relate to Belinsky's ideas about the purpose of How do they relate to Belinsky's ideas about the purpose of literature, which you can find in his letter to Gogol? How do they relate to the utopian experiments of the 1920s? Number 3. Clark describes the effort to bring the two theories together as a sort of modal schizophrenia. She asserts that Soviet novels feel kitschy and poorly written because they're trying to bring together two opposite tendencies. She describes these through a variety of terms. She says it's the everyday plus the heroic, verisimilitude plus the mythic or utopian, complexity plus simplicity, what is plus what ought to be. Can you unpack these terms? What does it mean for literature to try to do any of these things? How does each side of the plus sign fit together? So what I'm asking you to do is take like the everyday, verisimilitude, complexity, what is, and explain that. And then at the same time say, look at the heroic, the mythic, simplicity, and what ought to be, and explain how those things fit together. So there's two things being put together. What are those things? How do they fit together, if at all? What makes it hard to work across that plus sign? What makes it hard to put these two sides of the equation together? And do you think that schizophrenic is the right word to use here? Number 4, are these two tendencies, the what is and the what ought to be, are they ultimately incompatible? Is this a recipe for bad literature in your view? Is the problem that Soviet novelists aren't sure what they're supposed to do? Or is it that they're being asked to do something which is, on the face of it, impossible? Number 5. According to Clark, the way socialist realism asked Soviet writers to think of the world does make sense within Stalinist rhetoric. Soviet citizens in the 1930s were encouraged to think of themselves as living through and striving in real time, but also to project themselves into the glorious future and envision future Soviet achievements as if they had already been achieved. So why might this type of vision be particularly important to the Soviet project? Is it sustainable in the long term? Can it survive something like Khrushchev's secret speech? Number 6. Read through Appendix A and explain the steps of the master plot to yourself in your own words. Now, you don't have to write that in your blog post. I just want to make sure that you understand what they are, that you can sort of actively articulate what are the 6 steps of the master plot. Now, think about Kitaev's Time Forward. Can you trace the steps of the master plot in the excerpt from the novel that we read for today? Does it make a good story? Does it leave you with a sense of that you understand Soviet values and what it means to be a new Soviet person? If you were a Soviet citizen, would you find it reassuring or annoying that every novel you read followed the same basic story arc? Do we have literary genres that serve a similar purpose today? Number 7. The first section of Time Forward sets up a particular kind of rhythm. Read it out loud to yourself, and I really mean out loud. You might find that this rhythm is similar to Mosolov's Iron Foundry, which we listened to last time. What do you make of this echo of the avant-garde showing up in socialist realism? How does it help to bring together the disparate elements of what is and what ought to be? We also get lots of details about the production of concrete in this passage. Like, by the time you have read this part of the novel, you actually know how to make cement. So why might that be a useful thing in a socialist realist novel? Number 8. What is the source of drama in this excerpt of the novel, the whole thing that I've assigned you? What is the source of drama? You might find that you get pretty swept up in it. I know that I do. What's the message here about the first 5-year plan? What would a good Stalinist citizen like Pasha Angelina think of this piece of literature? What would a bad citizen like Ekaterina Elitskaya think? If you were someone like the young Ludmila Alexeyeva, how would your reaction to a novel like this help you think through your relationship to the Soviet government? Number 9. Because this novel is so realistic, there are some specific moments that are revealing. For one, when the brigade first thinks they've broken the world record, everybody totally collapses from exhaustion. For another, when Smetana gets seriously injured, the brigade carries on like nothing happened. Finally, almost at the end of their marathon shift, we learn that the concrete hasn't actually been tested and it might not be fit for use. So what do these moments reveal about the ethos and methods of the first 5-year plan? And why do you think Kataev included these less than flattering passages? How do they help to build up the mythology of Soviet labor? Number 10. The last passage of this excerpt takes place in the superintendent's office, where the staff is putting together propaganda materials. Georgy Vasilyevich is writing an article, which we get a quote from. Find the paragraph that begins, "Recently we have noted two opposing currents." Read that closely. What are the two sides of this debate? In what way is this reminiscent of Stalin's social revolution? How does this novel, written in 1932, work to ensure that Soviet citizens understand the deposing of the bourgeois experts and the creation of the new Stalinist elite in the right way? Number 11. Now let's look at Zhdanov's speech, Soviet Literature, the Richest in Ideas. The first 5 paragraphs of this speech are not about literature, they're about economics. This seems weird. But then in the 6th paragraph, Zhdanov turns from talking about all the Soviet Union's economic successes to talking about some economic areas where things are not going so well yet. How is he exhibiting socialist realist thinking by setting up his speech this way? If this speech has a story arc, who's the hero? Number 12. Eventually, Zhdanov gets down to business. Find the paragraph that begins, "The key to the success of Soviet literature is to be sought for." Read that paragraph and the next 2 closely. Can you unpack his claims here? According to Zhdanov, what role is literature expected to play in Soviet society? How does this compare to his assessment of, quote, contemporary bourgeois literature in the next few paragraphs? Is it fair to assess literature by its relationship to the economic basis of the society in which it was created? Is a corrupt or decaying society incapable of producing good literature? Will a thriving society always produce good literature? Number 13. Zhdanov quotes Stalin's famous line that writers are the engineers of human souls. We might consider this metaphor itself in light of the drive to build up heavy industry during the first 5-year plan. But let's look further. Find the paragraph with that quote in it. Make a close reading of the text from there up until where he says, "This method in belles lettres and literary criticism is what we call the method of socialist realism." So this is sort of giving us Zhdanov's full definition of socialist realism. What do you make of this definition? Why isn't he being more specific? How might it be a good strategic move for Soviet officials to leave it just a little bit vague? Do you think that literature is really capable of engineering a human soul at all? And my last question for you is, throughout this speech, it's clear that the Soviet state is now taking literature extremely seriously. What are the pros and cons of a government that cares this much about the arts? How might artists benefit? How might they be harmed? If you were an artist, what would you prefer? To be given strong support but also ideological restrictions? Or to have the freedom to fully express yourself but also to starve? Those are my questions, and I am looking forward to your posts.